Hello everyone, welcome to Learn with AI. So in today's video, I want to learn what is an inflation. Inflation is the rate at which the general level of prices for goods and services rises over time, leading to a decrease in the purchasing power of money. In simpler terms, as inflation increases, each unit of currency buys fewer goods and services. Example, if a loaf of bread costs $2 today and inflation is 5%, that same loaf might cost two $2.01 next year, $2.10 next year. Your money loses value. What cost $100 a year ago might cost $105 now. Some of the key points are purchasing power, the value of money in terms of what it can buy, price index, tools like the CPI, Consumer Price Index, track inflation, hyperinflation, extremely rapid inflation, deflation, the opposite of inflation, prices go down. So what are the causes of inflation? There are three different types of inflation based on ChatGPT. First, demand pulled inflation, too much money chasing too few goods. Cost push inflation, rising production costs such as wages and materials. And third, monetary inflation, when central banks print too much money. So why does inflation matter? A moderate level of inflation is normal in a growing economy. High inflation can erode savings, increase the cost of living, and create uncertainty. Central banks like Federal Reserve, or Bank of Canada aim to control inflation, often targeting around 2% annually. That's interesting. So inflation is the rate at which the general level of prices for goods and services rises over time, leading to a decrease in the purchasing power of money. If inflation erodes the purchasing power, why is it desirable for countries to aim for a moderate level or 2% annually? Where did 2% justification came from? Okay, so I've asked if inflation erodes the purchasing power of individual, why is it desirable for countries to aim for a moderate level of inflation? So ChatGPT replies, even though inflation reduces purchasing power, moderate inflation plays a strategic role in keeping the economy healthy and growing. Here's why most central banks like Fed or BOC aim for around 2% inflation annually. Some of the reasons are it encourages spending and investment. If people know prices will rise gradually, they are more likely to spend or invest money rather than hoard it. This stimulates the economy. Prevents deflation. Deflation, which is a fall in prices, sounds good, but it leads to delayed spending, lower profits, wage cuts, and economic stagnation. A 2% buffer helps avoid this. Wage flexibility. Employers may find it easier to manage real wages with mild inflation rather than cutting nominal wages, which workers resist. Inflation reduces real wages gradually. Room for interest rates. Inflation lets central banks keep interest rates above 0%. If inflation were 0%, rates would hit zero more often, limiting tools to fight recessions. Measurement errors. Price indices like CPI aren't perfect. A 2% target accounts for small overestimations in inflation measurement. The 2% inflation target isn't based on a precise formula. It's a policy convention that emerged from a mix of theory, history, and practical experience. New Zealand was the first country to adopt an explicit inflation target in 1990, initially choosing a range 0 to 2%, which evolved into 2%. Other countries followed, especially in the 90s, as inflation targeting became a credible tool for central banks to anchor expectations. The Fed formally adopted a 2% target in 2012, though it had operated near that level for years. So key summary here, 2% inflation is low enough not to damage purchasing power too much, yet high enough to keep the economy flexible and resilient. Okay, so I kind of want to go back. We learned about what the inflation is, which is the rate at which the general level of prices for goods and services rises over time, leading to a decrease in the purchasing power of money. And as inflation increases, each unit of currency buys fewer goods and services. And it gave me an example of a loaf of bread, which costs at 2% today, but due to 5% inflation, it's going to cost $2.10 next year. And then some of the key points, I kind of want to go back to the causes of inflation. So you mentioned that there are three types of inflation. Of the above three, which one accounts for the most inflation that we see today? Also, was inflation did inflation exist in the past? Okay, so let's break this down into two parts. Part one, which type of inflation dominates today? Exactly, that was the question I was going for, and it put it more nicely. In today's economies, inflation usually doesn't come from just one source, but we can say most common today is demand pull plus monetary inflation. So it's going to be a combined, it's going to be a combination of two. In most modern economies, especially during and after events like the pandemic, inflation was primarily driven by a mix of demand pull inflation, which is a government's issued stimulus checks. People had more money, but supply chains were strained. As a result, demand rose faster than supply, pushing prices up. Monetary inflation. Central banks lowered interest rates and increased the money supply to stimulate the economy. This excess liquidity also contributed to higher demand and asset price inflation. Cost push inflation also contributed, but to a lesser extent overall, except in specific sectors such as fuel and energy prices due to war in Ukraine or supply chain issues such as chip shortages, shipping bottlenecks. Some of the recent examples are US, UK, and many countries saw 6 to 9% inflation, mainly from demand pull plus monetary expansion, with supply shocks and rising wages adding cost push pressure. Part 2. Did inflation exist in the past? Yes, inflation is not a modern phenomenon. Though the term inflation is modern, used widely from the 19th century, the concept has existed for thousands of years. Let's look historically. Ancient times, Roman Empire, emperors debased silver coins, leading to monetary inflation. Prices rose and economic trust declined. Medieval period, Europe, and then modern history, post-World War I Germany, and then 1970s oil crisis. Okay, so I'm gonna go back and ask some more follow-up questions to ChatGPT. So let's just recap what we learned. So inflation, rate at which the general level of prices for goods and services rise over time, leading to a decrease in the purchasing power of money. Some of the examples were provided here. And then there were 3 causes of inflation where ChatGPT answered. The modern day inflation are caused by the combination of demand pull inflation, where especially in pandemic there was a shortage of supply which skyrocketed the price, and then there was a monetary inflation where central bank lowered interest rates to provide liquidity to the economy, which then made it where we have a fixed amount of goods and then more money that chase after the same goods. So again, it caused inflation. So how does central bank control inflation? Also, how is inflation measured? Okay, so these 2 questions are core to understanding how modern economies function. Let's tackle them clearly. Part 1. How do central banks control inflation? Central banks, like Fed or BOC, use monetary policy tools to keep inflation stable, usually aiming for 2% annually. Main tools used by central banks are, first, interest rates. How it works is central banks set a key rate called a federal funds rate. Commercial banks follow this to lend. The effect on inflation is if the central bank raises rates to make borrowing more expensive, it's going to slow spending and it's going to lower inflation, and then lower rates conversely will stimulate spending. And then there's open market operations, which is a buying or selling of government bonds. When you sell bonds, so when central banks sell bonds to a third-party entity, then it's going to reduce money supply in the economy, so it's going to cool down the economy. Whereas if the central bank buy bonds, then it's going to be injecting money to the economy, which would then stimulate growth. Reserve requirements. Banks must hold a certain percentage of deposit in reserve. Higher requirements would mean less lending, and it's going to slow down the economy. And then we have a quantitative easing or tightening, buying or selling large amounts of financial assets. Quantitative easing increases money supply which is used during crisis. Quantitative tightening is used to tighten and reduce inflation. Forward guidance, communicating future policy intentions, and shapes market expectations and spending behavior. How raising interest rates slow inflation. By central banks raising interest rates, it's going to make borrowing more expensive, and then people and businesses will spend less, and eventually the demand will fall, and then prices stabilizes or fall. Because people and business will be spending less money, the demand of products will go down. And how is inflation measured? Inflation is measured by tracking changes in the average prices of a basket of goods and services over time. Key indices used to measure inflation are CPI, measures price changes of a typical basket such as food, rent, gas, healthcare for consumers, and then it's widely used worldwide. And then there's a producer price index, measures prices received by producers early in the supply chain, indicates future inflation trends. And then there's a personal consumption expenditures, broader than CPI, includes substitution effects and reflects actual spending patterns. It's favored by the US Fed. And then GDP deflator, measures prices of all goods and services in GDP, used for macroeconomic comparisons. CPI breakdown is categorized into housings accounts for 30 to 40%, food and beverages 15%, transportation 15%, healthcare 7 to 10%, and others accounts for the remaining. And prices are tracked monthly, and inflation is reported as a year-over-year percentage change. Okay, so I think what I'm gonna do for to sum up today's conversation is I'm gonna ask ChatGPT to summarize the key points of today's discussion and generate PowerPoint slide. So we're gonna give it a couple of minutes to generate the PowerPoint slides, and then maybe what I'll do, oh, there it is. So let's open it up. Let's download the file. And then I'm gonna save it in the Learn with AI folder. And then I'm gonna open it up. So today we learned about inflation, where inflation is the rate at which prices increase over time and it reduces the purchasing power of money. Some examples are, if inflation is 5%, a $2 item today may cost $2.10 next year. And the central banks aims for 2% inflation because it's going to encourage spending and investment, and then it helps avoid deflation, and it provides wage and interest rate flexibility, and it accounts for measurement errors. There are 3 causes of inflation. First one being demand pull, too much demand, and if there are not enough supply, then it's gonna increase the price of goods. Cost push, rising production cost increases prices. So that would mean if a factory were producing some kind of goods such as baseball, chips, or smartphones, and then if the price that goes into that production cost increases, then the businesses will try to push that price over to a consumer. Third one was monetary inflation driven by monetary policy, so too much money in circulation. Otherwise, central bank are reducing interest rates, and then is making borrowing more easy, and then that would pour more fuel to the economy. And then some of the historical examples of inflations were in ancient Rome, 16th century Europe, post-World War I January, post-World War I Germany, in the 1970s oil crisis, and then in 2020 we had a COVID-19. And how does central bank control inflation? They use interest rates. They sometimes raise interest rate to reduce spending, so that would be the case if there's high inflation. And then open market operations, they can also sell bonds, government bonds, or I guess corporate bonds, I'm not too sure, to reduce money supply. And then reserve requirements such as quantitative easing and quantitative tightening, and then forward guidance to shape expectations. And then inflation is measured by the following key matrices such as CPI, PPI, PCE, and GDP deflator. So there you have it. For today's discussion, we learned about inflation and then how to ask questions to ChatGPT to ask for more clarity, and asking ChatGPT to provide the summary PowerPoint as well. So we'll continue our learning in our next session. Thank you, everyone. Feel free to comment, share your thoughts, and provide feedback. Thank you.